Hello, Baker here, and today we'll be discussing linguistics. Now, localization in video games is much like UI. When it's good, no one really gives it credit, but when it's bad, people immediately notice. I mean, look at a game like FF7 and how it gets memed on to this day. Luckily, we've come a long way since then, with FF14 in particular really standing out as an excellent English localization. Now, before we jump into talking about FF14's localization, I want to dedicate a section to talking about translation as a whole, and also differences between Japanese and English language and culture. As with the previous video, this video is fully spoiler-free as well. Okay, so for those that don't delve too much into other languages, it's easy to assume that translating is simply a matter of finding a bloke who is fluent in both languages, and they sort of just speedrun through the text. Because once you understand what a word means in another language, you can translate it, right? Unfortunately, it's a little more involved than that. Languages evolve all the time, and they evolve in different directions, which means that eventually there will be drastic differences between them. How difficult the translation process is depends on how closely related the two languages are. An easy way to look at this is to see if the two languages belong in one or multiple language families. A language family basically means a group of languages that all descend from the same origin language, or proto-language. Even though they will develop into their own directions as dictated by their culture, there will be some principles that remain even after hundreds of years, because the languages come from the same foundation. The more of these original traits remain between the languages, the easier it will be to translate them. English is a Germanic language, or on a wider scale, an Indo-European language. This means that if you were to translate it to, say, French or German or Spanish, you'd have an easier time than a language outside of this group. To give you an example, I'm Finnish, right? My language comes from a completely different origin to English, and it's outside of both groups I just mentioned. So if you were to translate from Finnish to English, instead of, say, French to English, you'd find there are all of a sudden a lot more things you have to pay attention to, because those foundations I mentioned are not there anymore. To give you an example, Finnish doesn't even use articles. It has 15 noun cases, a very flexible word order, and the list goes on. There's basically nothing in common with English, except the alphabet, though that too has drastic differences in its application. And keep in mind, Finland is still a part of Europe. Even in the same continent, there are many languages that have almost nothing in common. Now imagine a language whose origins come from the other side of the world, and that's where you get the difference between Japanese and English. Two languages that evolved on different sides of the world, which is when things can get extra funky for a translator. At that point, being fluent in both languages simply isn't enough if you want to have a high-quality localization. It also takes a lot of effort on the translator's part. There are obviously a million differences between these languages, but the ones I want to focus on in this video are these. The first thing one needs to know when it comes to major differences between the languages is that Japanese is a high-context culture. The way they communicate tends to be implicit and indirect. They even have this phrase, kuki o yomu, which literally translates to reading the air. Of course, this idea of being able to read the room exists in all cultures and is a sign of good social skills, but the Japanese are far more sensitive to it, and it's more prevalent in their culture than in, say, English-speaking ones. In other words, it can be a bit vague at times. A lot of important information is either cut completely or it's implied heavily, which can be kind of confusing for Western readers. Also, in Japanese, it's a lot easier to describe a character's affection towards another character, their background, or their personality. This is because in the Japanese society, there exists this social system where the words that you use is affected by several factors, such as family relationships, the person's sex, differences in age, and differences in status. None of that exists in English, and if someone tried to impose it on English-speaking cultures, it would pretty much be rejected. The amount of expressiveness also changes. English can definitely be more expressive in certain areas, but the reverse can also be true. For instance, Japanese has an absolute shitload of onomatopoeic words or words that express sounds. Additionally, the use of kanji can relay ideas way more expressively than English words and in a simpler, quicker, and more efficient manner. In that sense, Japanese dialogue can more easily generate basic information relevant to the identification of the situation, which will be relevant later when we discuss FF14's localization. Other minor things include the diversity in honorifics, pronouns and suffixes, lack of attribution, and so on. We also have Japanese using English names/words to sound exotic. For example, Terra is Tina in FF6, or hallowed ground being called invincible in FF14. You could keep these the same in English and it would technically be correct, but you would lose the point. They are meant to sound exotic, not mundane. Besides the actual language structure, we have of course cultural differences. Language is culture and culture is language. The two are very much intertwined, so it doesn't come as a surprise then that what words we use, what expressions we use, how we communicate is influenced by the culture around us. And oh boy, are there massive differences between Japanese and Western culture. And this adds another complication. Let's suppose a character says something or behaves in a certain way. Is it always the right move to translate them the same way for Western audiences who might be completely unfamiliar with it, or they might consider it offensive or whatnot? Let me give you an example of probably the most contested and well-known translation difference in the franchise. What Yuna said to Tidus at the end of Final Fantasy X. The original Japanese line was "thank you," while the English line was "I love you." Now, at the first glance, one would look at that and be like, whoa, what the fuck? Because that's a huge change. But when we take a closer examination between the two cultures, we can better understand the translator's decision here. The way we express romantic love is very different between Western and Japanese culture. Japanese people very rarely use the actual words "I love you" to display romantic affection towards their partner. This is true for both in public and in private. In public, it's basically something that never happens, but even in private, it doesn't really happen either. In fact, it's very realistic and indeed probable that a Japanese woman could live her entire life without hearing those words from her husband. That is why, in the original script, it was much more natural for the Japanese audience to have her simply express her gratitude. In English, however, the opposite is true. After a romantic story between two individuals, a very direct expression of love by way of "I love you" sounds a lot more natural than "thank you," which would have sounded a lot more jarring to the Western audience. But ultimately, there is no wrong or right answer, which is why this single line of dialogue can still be seen debated at times even 2 decades after the game came out. And that is what I wish to demonstrate with this video. Localization can be complicated at times. When you translate to a different audience, you want to make it resonate with that audience as much as possible, and that will sometimes call for taking liberties when it comes to changing the text. Obviously, this topic is broad and one could spend a while on this, but it's due to factors such as these that you often cannot simply do a one-to-one translation in storytelling. Yes, you could find the closest equivalent thing in English to whatever you are translating, but even though it may appear correct on the surface, it could still be a poor translation because it comes across as sounding unnatural to how we are used to hearing English being spoken. That is why you have to take some liberties and infer what the intent was and how to convey that same intent through English. So it basically becomes a puzzle of, okay, how do I convey this thing but in a slightly different way? This is made further difficult when there's no voice acting and it's just text, which is the case for a lot of FF14. Speaking of which, let's actually discuss FF14's localization. What makes it so great? There is a good reason for it, and it's actually in the nature of how the game is localized. So the most common way to do a translation in this industry is to do a one-way translation, which is when the game script is produced in its entirety in the original language, and then that script is given to the localization team, and they translate it to English or whichever language. FF14 is unique because it doesn't follow this model. Rather, the translations get worked on in parallel. This is something that they were already doing with FF11, and FF14 followed that idea. This practice is quite rare, but the FF14 devs felt strongly about doing it, and I'll explain why in a bit. Now, let me explain the difference between these two ways of translating. In the traditional method, the one-way translation, the whole script would be completed on the original language when it arrives at the translator's office. This means that whatever is on there and what is created in the game is simply there. It's there and you can't do shit about it, so the translator simply has to work around it. If there is something that is virtually impossible to translate because by its very nature it makes zero sense to the Western audience, then too bad. On the other hand, because of the way they do it in 14, the localization teams work closely together already during production. They literally work in the same office, where contacting each other only takes about 5 seconds. This makes it very easy for the localization teams to clarify the intent of the writers, but additionally, it means that they can actually influence what is being written. If they see something that would not resonate well to a non-Japanese audience, and from there it's up to the team whether they choose to do it anyway or ask for opinions on what could be changed. Likewise, the writers can come to the localization teams and ask for their input. The mind-blowing part being that this effectively means that there are parts of the game that are written in English first and then translated to Japanese. This is awesome because it gives the game a much more international feel, since inputs from multiple cultures enrichen the script already in their development stages. And this is exactly why the developers wanted to do it that way. Let's use the playable races as an example. The Lalafell were influenced by the Japanese team, the Elesen by the French team, the Rogaden by the German team, and the Mikodean here by the English team. As for things being changed in development, sadly, we aren't privy to many of these as players for the obvious reason that they were, changed, but some I recall from interviews were, for example, Artbird's Brofist in Shadowbringers, which was something the English localization team insisted on, because originally it wasn't supposed to be there, since it's not a very common gesture in Japan. Or the dwarves originally meaning to have trees in their eyes when they were knocked out, but was instead changed to spiral eyes to have it make more sense for people outside of Japan. But the point is that it works and it allows the localization teams way more freedom, which, as I described earlier in this video, is a good thing, because you need that liberty to convey the message in the way you best see fit. In fact, due to the way FF14 is developed, the English version couldn't even be considered a second translation in the traditional sense. Rather, you could almost think of it as another script entirely. Because of this, the English localization is very bold, and it makes some drastic changes all around, from minor stuff all the way to actually changing the characters' personalities and traits a bit. Here, I'm going to talk about some of the differences between the two. Due to the spoiler-free nature of this video, I cannot go too much into specific examples, so keep that in mind. So the first thing we have to talk about is the medieval English, / the Old English / the Shakespearean English, whatever you wanna call it, that is prevalent in the English script. This came to be because of the influence of the Ivalice games on FF14 development, since those games too heavily featured Shakespearean English, so it was a natural transition for the localization team. This style is something that is almost completely absent from the Japanese version. Some few characters do use things like old honorifics, like the Sultana, but that's about it. The reason for this is that there is really no equivalent of Shakespearean English in Japanese. They do have Old Japanese, but the problem is that the difference between modern and Old Japanese is so big that the vast majority of Japanese citizens cannot understand the language. Apparently, they do have plays that use that version of Japanese, but the lines are translated in real time to modern Japanese for the audience. This is a big difference in contrast to modern English versus Shakespearean English. Sure, you may not fully understand some parts of that medieval way of speech, but it's actually very easy for you to pick up on the meaning of sentences by only understanding modern English. I can personally attest to that, since I, as a non-native speaker, didn't really have difficulty understanding any of the English spoken in FF14. Of course, there have been some minor amounts of critique from people regarding the Shakespearean English, but for like 99% of players, it's fine.
What rhymes with balls? And I was like, oh, can we call the god Thal? And he was like, I don't know, it's kind of short. I kind of want a longer name in Japanese. And so how about like Naldthal? And it's like, oh, Naldthal's bloody balls. I mean, no. It doesn't have the good ring to it.
It doesn't
like,
roll off your tongue, I guess.
mean, so how about we like make Naldthal, we split it and make it like a double aspected god. So basically, before I mentioned anything, it was just a regular god that was going to be the god of the afterlife. And then I said, because I wanted to use Thal separately, so for Thal's bloody balls and Thal's balls, I made him a dual-aspected god. So that's how Naldthal became dual-aspected, is so I could use Thal with Thal's balls.
In addition to the Shakespearean English, the English localization also uses a huge variety of different types of speeches, such as pirate speak or thieves' cant, as well as a whole slew of accents. These do of course appear in Japanese as well, but I'd like to say they are much more numerous in English. The beast tribes all having these unique speech patterns is something that is done to get around the Japanese having a never-ending list of suffixes that they can apply to each beast tribe. But in general, the English version could be described as more flavorful, while Japanese is more direct or mundane or whatever you want to call it. This is probably the easiest to demonstrate with an example from the game itself. I am going to read a line of dialogue translated directly to English from Japanese and then the English version. So first, the Japanese line. Oh, I was tempered. That's the Japanese line. Now in English the same line. No, a moment, my thoughts are clouded and this body is not mine own. So notice how the Japanese version conveys the information a lot more directly, whereas in English the term tempered isn't even used. They don't say they were tempered, rather they describe themselves being tempered. This also applies to how flavor text, quest names, fates and so on are much more to the point in Japanese, whereas in English they like to use these as opportunities to insert pop culture references and funny memes. It always puts a smile on my face when I see a cheeky quest name like Get to the Copper or a fate named Pray Destroy the Waking Sands. Even the Japanese audience loves these, and at some point they even started asking if the devs could bake some of those into the Japanese version as well. Finally, just because, I want to list the 3 examples I've heard the most over the years of characters that are a bit different. Midgard Solmer is way more ominous in the English version. English Frey is so different to Japanese Frey, it's practically a rewrite. And probably the most known case, Oshifon. In Japanese, he's let's just say he's a bit more horny. This aspect of his character was completely removed in the English version because the localization team feared, and rightly so, that he would simply come across as a creep to the Western audience. These are just a few examples, but just know that some characters probably differ in some ways between the two. There is a certain small group of people in this community who like to criticize the English localization, and from my experience this happens with basically every JRPG. People see excerpts from the Japanese script and go, "Whoa, the Japanese original is way better, what is up with this shitty tarnished English translation?" If you are one of these people, I want you to bear in mind precisely the things I discussed at the start of this video. Translation isn't that simple. Also, for people who don't like FF14's way of localizing and instead wanted a more traditional way of translating, all I can say is that perhaps FF14 simply isn't the game you are looking for, because they didn't go for that style. If you want an experience closer to the Japanese script, if you can speak French or German, I recommend you play those versions instead, since they are closer to the Japanese script. In any case, please understand that the way FF14 is localized has been very successful. Both the devs and fans love it, and it's not going to change anytime soon, or ever. And finally, if you want a game that is a very literal translation, I can wholeheartedly recommend the original Final Fantasy VII, which did precisely that. You can go play that game and tell me how much you loved that translation. Alright, that's all I wanted to say on the subject of localization. I hope this video didn't bore those of you that aren't much into linguistics. I was trying to keep it as brief as I could. I also want to emphasize that I'm not very well versed in Japanese culture and language. For me, a lot I said in this video was secondhand knowledge, so if there were some mistakes in this video, I implore you to point them out. As always, if you like this content, do drop a sub to stick around because I am going to be dropping more of these videos in the near future. Have a nice day!